At 3:30-3 on the morning of October 20-5th, 1940-4, the darkness of Surigao Strait was torn apart by a blinding flash of fire. The USS West Virginia's 16-inch guns opened fire first at a range of 30,000 yards, shells slicing through the night sky with devastating force toward the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. And every ship in the battle line behind the West Virginia had once lain at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. In 18 minutes, the American battle line unleashed 200 undated-5 armor-piercing shells, each weighing over a ton, slamming into the Japanese steel giants at supersonic speed. 40-6 minutes later, the Yamashiro, along with her crew of 1,600 men, sank into the abyss of Surigao Strait, leaving only burning oil and floating wreckage on the surface. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura knew the Americans were waiting at the end of the strait, yet he charged in without hesitation. Of his 7 warships, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and for destroyers, only a single destroyer, the Shigure, survived the crossing. Over 4,000 Japanese sailors perished in those 40-6 minutes. The second Japanese force, arriving behind Nishimura, saw the burning wreckage floating on the water and turned around without firing a single shot. The last battleship engagement in human history was over before dawn. But the true beginning of this battle was not at Surigao Strait, it was 3 years earlier, on that morning at Pearl Harbor. At 7:50-5 on the morning of December 7th, 1940-1, the first Japanese torpedoes struck the American battleships at Pearl Harbor. The West Virginia took 6 torpedoes into bombs. Her port side dripped open by massive gashes as she listed and sank rapidly. The California was hit by torpedoes and bombs, slowly settling to the harbor bottom. The Tennessee was struck by 2 bombs. Though she did not sink, she was severely damaged. The Maryland and Pennsylvania were also hit by bombs, and these proud ships of the American Navy were sunk or heavily damaged at their moorings. Black smoke obscured the sky over Oahu as the Imperial Japanese Navy chose this unannounced attack to declare war on America. Japan's planners made what seemed a reasonable judgment that damaged battleships might be salvaged, but the process would take years, and the repaired ships would merely be restored to their original condition. This judgment was based on Japan's own ship repair experience, and under the conditions of the time, this reasoning was not absurd. After all, ship repair was just repair. Who would think to transform a sunken vessel into an entirely new weapon? Yet they made a fatal error. They underestimated the creative power that the American naval engineering establishment could unleash under the pressure of war. The disaster at Pearl Harbor gave America to things an urgent reason to salvage warships from the ocean floor and a precious to -year window of time. These 2 years were not merely time to repair the ships, they were time to install a revolutionary technology aboard them. The Mark 8 fire control radar, a device still only a prototype in December 1940-1, was installed on every repaired battleship during the Reconstruction period. Before Pearl Harbor, American battleships relied on optical radiophasor and visual observation, making their night combat capability extremely limited. The Mark 8 radar completely changed this equation, enabling ships to precisely lock onto targets, even in total darkness, a tactical capability no naval commander had previously imagined. The ships Japan believed it had eliminated return to battle in an entirely different form. Japan sank battleships, while America used the salvage time to build fundamentally different weapons. This is the deepest irony of the Battle of Surigao Strait. Japan created the conditions for its own destruction at the hands of its opponent. Let us return to that decisive night. At 3 in the morning on October 20-5th, 1940-4, Surigao Strait was shrouded in heavy darkness. The sea was eerily calm, broken only by occasional distant flashes of fire. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fuel oil. The Japanese battleship Fuso had already been hit by torpedoes and broken into, her to burning halves drifting on the water. Flames illuminated the floating oil and debris, lighting up a horrifying corridor of death in the strait. When Vice Admiral Nishimura arrived at the mouth of the strait with his remaining forces, this was the desperate scene before him. But he did not retreat. Nishimura was a traditional naval officer. Obedience to orders was his duty, even if it meant sailing into a death trap. In the Japanese military culture, retreat was more unacceptable than death. Nishimura chose the path of certain death, leading his fleet resolutely into the throat of the strait. At the other end of the strait, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldenour had completed his deployment. He commanded 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 20-8 destroyers, and 30-9 PT boats. These forces were carefully arranged into a deadly trap, waiting for the Japanese to sail into it. Oldenour employed the most classic formation in naval warfare, crossing the T. He deployed his battle line horizontally across the northern end of the strait, perpendicular to the Japanese column approach. The brilliance of this formation was that every one of his ships could bring its full broadside firepower to bear, while the Japanese column could only use its forward, facing guns. PT boats served as the outermost warning and harassment layer. Destroyers in the middle launched torpedo attacks, and cruisers and battleships formed the main fire position at the rear, a layered defense advancing step by step. The Yamashiro, as the Japanese flagship, could only use for 14-inch guns from her to forward turrets in column formation, roughly 1-3rd of her main battery firepower. The aft turrets, while capable of firing to the rear, had extremely limited opportunities to bear in the confined strait, and even when turning could only obtain brief firing windows. Meanwhile, every ship in the American battle line could fire full broadsides, with all main battery turrets trained on the target. West Virginia's 8 16-inch guns were all in action. The California and Tennessee had 12 14-inch guns, and the Maryland and Pennsylvania also had their main guns in line. The cruisers on both flanks added their firepower as well, dozens of 8-inch and 6-inch guns joining this steel storm. The American battle line could deliver roughly 6 times the weight of metal per minute that Nishimura's force could return. This was not a contest of equals, it was a meticulously designed slaughter. Moreover, the Americans were firing accurately from the moment the Japanese came within the Mark 8 radar's effective engagement range. The targets they were firing had been tracked for hours before the engagement began. While the Japanese were still groping forward in the darkness, the Americans already knew everything about them. The key to all of this was the Mark 8 fire control radar. This radar could track targets far beyond visual range. The West Virginia detected the Yamashiro at 40-2,000 yards, a distance far exceeding visual contact. In the pitch-black strait, while the Japanese could not yet see the enemy, the Americans already precisely knew their position, course, and speed. Radar data was fed directly into the fire control system, which calculated firing solutions, and then the main guns opened fire. The entire process was completed in darkness. The Japanese did not even know where the shells were coming from. They could only see massive water swoops suddenly erupting on the surface. This technological advantage made the outcome certain from the very beginning. The Japanese were not facing a fleet they could fight. They were facing a precision-operating killing machine. A ship without radar in night combat was like a blind man, while a ship with radar possessed eagle eyes that could pierce the darkness. This technological gap was more lethal than any numerical advantage. The battle unfolded like a carefully choreographed ritual of destruction. 10:30-6 in the evening on October 20-4th, American PT boats made first contact with Nishimura's force and began continuously reporting their position and course. These small, fast boats darted through the darkness, radioing the Japanese positions back to headquarters, providing precise intelligence for the main fleet behind. At approximately 2 in the morning on October 20-5th, American destroyers launched coordinated torpedo salvos, dozens of torpedoes tracing deadly paths through the dark. The water was filled with torpedo wakes, like white fingers of death reaching toward the Japanese fleet. The Fuso was hit and eventually broke into and sank, over 1,400 of her crew perishing, most without even time to escape their compartments. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk or disabled, twisted and deformed by torpedo explosions, steel melting in the flames. The Yamashiro was also hit by torpedoes but continued northward, this battered warship pressing onward with indomitable will toward the depths of death. At 3:30-3 in the morning, the West Virginia opened fire at 30,000 yards, and the entire battle line followed. The crossing of the T was executed perfectly, dozens of large -caliber main guns roaring simultaneously, the sea surface lit up like daylight by muzzle flashes, the massive shockwaves trembling across both shores of the strait. At 4:19 in the morning, the Yamashiro sank, Vice Admiral Nishimura going down with her. At approximately 4:30, Vice Admiral Shima arrived with the 2nd Japanese force, saw the burning wreckage, quickly assessed the situation, and immediately ordered a withdrawal. He realized that continuing forward would only lead his fleet to the same fate as Nishimura's. The only significant American casualties came from friendly fire. The destroyer Albert W. Grant was hit by Japanese shells during the torpedo attack phase, and then, as she slowed in the water, was struck again by American shells from the battle line and cruisers. In the chaotic night engagement, all ships were firing at the same area from multiple directions, making friendly fire almost inevitable. The friendly fire killed 30-8 American sailors, men killed by their own side shells, one of war's cruelest ironies. The Grant survived and was eventually repaired, but those 30-8 lives could never be restored. Throughout the entire battle, not a single ship in Olden or 5th's battle line was hit by Japanese fire. The Japanese never even had the chance to inflict any effective damage on the American main force. The destroyer Shigure was the sole survivor of Nishimura's force, her survival itself a miracle. Throughout the battle, torpedoes passed through her without detonating. Shell splashes fell around her without hitting anything vital, as if an invisible shield surrounded her. Her captain filed an after-minus action report describing everything he had witnessed, the Fuso breaking into unsinking, destroyers going down one after another. The Yamashiro continuing north through the bombardment until she could continue no more, finally capsizing and disappearing beneath the waves. His report contained no heroic rhetoric, only a calm narration of those 40-6 minutes of hellish imagery. Shigure's subsequent fate followed a pattern common to surviving vessels in catastrophic engagements. She was damaged in later operations, repaired, and then sunk by an American submarine in January 1940-5. Her captain survived, but the Shigure ultimately could not escape the war's grasp. War's pursuit of survivors never stops because of a single miracle. Olden or 5th continued to be promoted after the war, eventually reaching the rank of full admiral. When asked about Surigao Strait, he described it in measured terms. His battleships were old and slow, but they could shoot. The engagement went as planned, which is not how naval battles usually go. Naval battles are typically filled with chaos, surprise, and unpredictable variables, but Surigao Strait was an exception. From the moment he received his orders on the afternoon of October 20-4th, Olden or 5th had complete control over every element of the situation. He chose the battlefield, deployed his forces, and set the conditions of engagement. The Japanese merely played the role assigned to them in his script. This kind of complete control over a battle is extremely rare in naval history, requiring not just tactical competence but technological superiority as its foundation. The Mississippi was the 6th ship in Olden or 5th's battle line, and the only one that had not been at Pearl Harbor. She fired the last salvo of the engagement, more an accident of timing than deliberate design. She fired at a target that had not yet been confirmed as sunk, and the Yamashiro was already going down when the Mississippi's shells arrived. This was the last time in recorded history that a battleship fired at another battleship in combat. Never again would two battleships engage each other at sea. This supreme form of naval warfare, which had endured for decades, came to a permanent end on that morning. The Mississippi's final salvo inadvertently became the swan song of the entire battleship era. From Pearl Harbor to Surigao Strait, this chain of causality is clear and cruel. Japan's planners chose to attack Pearl Harbor partly because destroying the American battle line would force the United States Navy to rely on aircraft carriers. This calculation was sound in 1940-1, when battleships were still the core of naval power and the role of aircraft carriers had not yet been fully validated. After all, in that era, no naval admiral would have believed that airplanes could replace big guns as the decisive force in naval warfare. But it failed to anticipate that America would use the reconstruction time to retrofit the sunk ships with technology that rendered battleship versus battleship combat obsolete. America's response to losing its battle line was not to restore it as it was, but to return to battle in a qualitatively transformed state. This transformation was not merely technological but also strategic. During the 2 years without battleships, the American Navy was forced to develop a carrier-centric operational system. The rebuilt battleships became auxiliary forces within this system. The disaster at Pearl Harbor became the catalyst for the transformation of the American Navy. If Japan's surprise attack had been conducted 6 months later, the Mark 8 radar might have already been installed on the ships while they were in active service. The same tactical destruction could have been achieved, but America would not have gained the reconstruction window. The timing of the attack created the very conditions for its own reversal. Japan forged the weapon of its own destruction, and this weapon was spawned by Japan's own actions. This historical irony is more haunting than any fiction. At Surigao Strait, Japan faced not the old style warships they had easily sunk 3 years earlier, but a new generation of C-going weapons transformed from the keel up. And the catalyst for this entire transformation was created by Japan itself. The outcome of the Battle of Surigao Strait was not determined by the brave decisions made in the strait on the morning of October 20-5th. Those certainly contributed. What made the outcome truly certain were decisions made years earlier that seemed unrelated to this engagement. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1940-1, they set in motion a chain reaction they could not control. They sank warships but gave America the opportunity to rebuild and upgrade them. They created a window of time without knowing how it would be exploited. They believed they were eliminating a threat when in fact they were nurturing a more powerful adversary. The law of historical causality often reveals its power in the most unexpected ways. The 5 surviving Pearl Harbor battleships continued in service after Surigao Strait. They bombarded beaches at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing fire support for landing forces. They performed the role battleships had always played once enemy air power was suppressed floating artillery, delivering large caliber shells against targets that needed to be destroyed before infantry could advance. They never fought another battleship again. The Imperial Japanese Navy had no more battleships to send. After Surigao Strait, Japan's battleship force existed in name only. The remaining ships had either been sunk in previous battles or were trapped in port for lack of fuel, unable to sortie. Once feared Japanese combined fleet was now reduced to memories and wreckage. Those steel giants that had once dominated the Pacific ultimately did not even have the chance to go to sea again. Left to slowly rust in port, waiting for the war to end. In January 1940-7, the West Virginia was decommissioned. In 1950-9, she was sold for scrap. The steel giant that had shaken Surigao Strait ultimately reduced to raw material in a smelting furnace. The California was decommissioned in February 1940-7 and likewise scrapped in 1950-9. The Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were decommissioned and scrapped in the same period. The ships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised, rebuilt, and then ended the battleship era were dismantled one by one in the decade after the war. Not one was preserved as a museum. Their existence survives only in historical records, salvage reports, reconstruction specifications, battle reports, shell expenditure, and hit statistics. These cold documents record a legendary journey from the ocean floor, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, transformed in shipyards, fulfilling their mission in the darkness of Surigao Strait, and finally reduced to nothing in scrapyards. The life of these ships mirrors the battleship era itself, glorious, tragic, and ultimately returned to dust. Mark 8 fire control radar itself quickly became obsolete. Naval warfare had already moved beyond the conditions that made Surigao Strait possible, even before the engagement took place. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the primary instrument of naval power. Carrier aircraft had an operational radius far exceeding any battleship's main gun range. A single torpedo or bomb could reduce a warship that took years to build to nothing. Pearl Harbor accelerated this transition by removing American battleships from the Pacific for 2 years, and demonstrating that carrier aircraft could accomplish what battleships could not. When the West Virginia fired at the Yamashiro, the battle line at the top of the T was already an anachronism being used for the last time. The terminator of the battleship era was the battleship itself, a poetic final chapter. Those ships reborn from the depths of Pearl Harbor ultimately buried their own era with their own guns. From the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, the era of the battleship as the primary instrument of naval power came to an end in Surigao Strait in the early hours of October 20-5th, 1940-4. It ended not in the dramatic clash of equals that naval strategists had anticipated for decades, but in 18 minutes of radar-minus directed gunfire in darkness. Delivered by ships one side had previously sunk against a fleet that had no answer for technology it had not anticipated. The outcome of this battle was determined long before, not in the darkness of Surigao Strait, but in the smoke of Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Just as the Japanese fleet crossed the T to defeat the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, just as Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805 through training and tactical superiority. Victory at Surigao Strait similarly stemmed from long preparation and accumulation. But unlike those battles, the advantage at Surigao Strait came directly from the enemy's own actions, and this is what makes it most unique. Nishimura knew what was waiting for him at the end of the strait. He went in anyway. His body was never recovered. The darkness of Surigao Strait swallowed him and his fleet, leaving behind only a heavy history of courage, technology, irony, and fate. Over 4,000 Japanese sailors perished with him beneath the waves, their names inscribed on monuments in Tokyo, but their stories gradually submerged by the long river of history. And those ships reborn from the depths of Pearl Harbor wrote the final footnote to the battleship era with 18 minutes of gunfire. The era began with the steam turbines of the Dread, not indented with the electronic pulses of the Mark 8 radar. From steel to electronics, from visual sighting to radar, from daylight to darkness, the essence of naval warfare underwent an irreversible transformation in the early hours of that morning in Surigao Strait. The starting point of it all was nothing more than a chain reaction triggered by a surprise attack 3 years earlier. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.